That's the maple syrup theme song for today.
Maple syrup.
One day we'll actually write one. Maple syrup show. And today we're welcoming Jay Little. Jay, how are you doing? What's going on?
I'm doing fantastic. Thank you very much. I really appreciate being invited on.
Well, I mean, so first of all, thank you very much for being a jury member for the pitch project, which is kind of how we got connected.
Yep.
And then you were so like involved, like I want more, I need more to do it. It was great.
Oh, absolutely.
And from there, it's just like, oh, Jay says some cool stuff. And just the other day, it was actually May 5th, when you said, I have this thought. And then I said, oh, do you want to come talk about that thought? Because it's a really, really good thought. And I was telling Jay and Erica before the show started that it's probably the number one question that any of us get asked. That's like a serious question about nitty-gritty game design. I'm not talking about like how did you get into the industry, because that's very common. But this is probably the
mechanic. Exactly.
This is probably the most common question that a game designer will get asked by other game designers. So it's nitty-gritty game design stuff, and it has to do with the B word, balance. But we're going to get to that in a second. Before we get there, Jay, can you tell us, who you are? How'd you get started in gaming and then into game design? Like, what drove you to this particular profession?
Dungeons and Dragons, without a doubt. I still remember very, very clearly. I was 8 years old. My older brother was the DM for the first time, and I was a fighter with a halberd fighting in the sewers against skeletons. And I remember that so vividly. And I'm a pack rat, so I still have character sheets and old weather-beaten tomes from early editions of Dungeons and Dragons. But that captured my imagination. That got me into reading more. But another big part of it is I grew up in southeast Wisconsin. So I grew up just minutes from Lake Geneva. It was about a 20-minute ride to Gen Con when it was still held in Milwaukee. And my friends and I actually knew the artists from that Dragonlance series, and Tracy Hickman and Margaret Weiss, and all of those people who were involved in Dungeons and Dragons at the time. We didn't know how lucky we were that we lived in that area during that time period. And I've been a gamer ever since. I expanded into board games in high school with Talisman from Games Workshop, the first edition of Talisman. And I've been hooked ever since. Sold my first game while I was still in college. I was just really, really motivated and tracked people down and showed them my games when I could. And then about 13 years ago now, I took a chance, relocated my family from St. Louis up to the Twin Cities to take a job at Fantasy Flight Games, which is probably where most people know my work from, when I was actively there designing stuff for Star Wars and Games Workshop.
Yeah, very, 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 very cool. So you have had a life full of gaming.
Yes.
And a lot of it is because of, your location in terms of being in Wisconsin and being near the epicenter of, TSR and everything like that. So that's pretty cool.
Serendipity work sometimes, that it really is. You don't realize who's your own backyard sometimes until you start jumping in.
I do need to give a shout out to my mom. She was an English teacher, and so word games were a really, really big part of growing up. Boggle, Scrabble, Perquacky, a lot of those things. So my vocabulary grew, got me more interested in reading. My niche was science fiction and fantasy literature, and then, just completely exploded from there with my interests. And my parents were always really, really supportive.
Awesome. And your mom was the teacher, you said?
Yes.
English teacher, or just like grade school teacher, or
grade school teacher, and predominantly math and English. So she made sure that we were always very respectful of school and education as we were growing up. And obviously that helps tie into critical thinking, being able to brainstorm, being able to think on your feet, plan ahead, and all of these strategies. I didn't realize just how influential my parents were until many, many years into this, going, oh, wow, I know how to plan. I know how to think about this. I know how to approach this problem. So I really, yeah.
That's perfect. And
like planning, you don't realize all the processes that go into it, all the molding that takes for your thinking. That you're like, oh, good, I got programmed early, right?
That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, and I mean, it is true that I think teachers are very, very influential in for the students who actually do listen to them, right? And did you think that that helped propel you into becoming a teacher yourself?
So it's interesting because about 10 years ago, I had some health problems, which forced me to separate with Fantasy Flight Games, which was really sad. But the connections that I made there really helped because UW Stout in Menominee, Wisconsin, suddenly found themselves short an instructor with just a few weeks before the semester started. So one of the professors there was married to Brian Bormueller, who was the distribution manager at Fantasy Flight Games. So they introduced me to some of the faculty and said, hey, you want to teach an introduction to game design class with us? I'd love to. And I've been doing that for about 7.5 years now.
Nice. Again,
Well, there you go.
know where things are going to lead, right? If
Yep.
you're sort of open to it.
Yeah, being open to it and not being afraid to ask yourself on to projects. I was going to keep that to the end, but since Sen had mentioned the pitch project, when I saw so many of my friends listed there as judges, I reached out to Sen and Jay and were like, I have to be involved in this. This sounds way too cool. Is there some way that I can contribute to this? So that was a really, really helpful and influential project to be a part of, but it also just reinforced that it's okay to ask questions and it's okay to go up to people and say, hey, is there a way I can get involved in this?
Put yourself out there in some way, for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Especially in this industry where, I think people, like, so many people have an idea for a game or something, and they just may not have the chops to execute or the connections, anything like that. And that's what a lot of us actually do have is we just don't have the time, but we have the experience, the skill, the connections to get that stuff done. And if you have the time, I'm more than willing to give you some of mine so that, that dream of yours can become something that I can actually play on my table one day. So.
And that's what I love about going to conventions, especially smaller conventions where you've got time between events where you can sit down with people and have one-on-one discussions about their dreams and aspirations with game design. And if they find my feedback or insight useful and helpful, then I'm really fortunate to be in that position.
Yeah, that's perfect too, because it's very different right now, obviously, without conventions for another couple of months.
Yeah, I know.
But the internet has definitely changed how I think all of us are working on design, are helping other people with design. And I just want to give a very quick plug to the Tabletop Membership Program. They are doing another round of mentoring and mentees and match people up together. And if you go to their website, www.tabletopmembership.org, I think.
Or mentorship.
Mentorship, yes, .org, I believe. They are looking for both mentors and mentees right now. And you can actually do both at the same time. Like, let's say, you were a skilled content creator, but you wanted to get into design. You might be a mentor for other newer content creators, but a mentee in game design. So it's a wonderful, wonderful program. They actually give out micro grants, like $100 micro grant to help with things, for just not everybody gets one, but they'll give out a bunch during the year or during the session,
and
the round.
Had a cool algorithm they've designed now too, right? Because originally they were doing it by hand. Now they're kind of processes, if I remember correctly. So that they try to match you up with the right type of person, and so far they said that it's been really successful because it's kind of in its own way like this pseudo dating app, but not really because it's like a service exchange, right? But like anything, it is a relationship when you are trying to teach somebody or share something or whatever it is, right? So you want to, hopefully get paired up with someone that is going to be more receptive to you.
And what I really like about this is, this sort of relationship, I'm fortunate that I had some mentors on my way coming up. I don't think I'd be where I am without that. So on either end of that, if you have the skills, knowledge, and time to share, that's fantastic. And I would strongly encourage people to do that. But again, if you're looking for information, if you want to get involved in the industry, if this is something you're passionate about, opportunities like these are the perfect way to step up and get involved.
Yeah. And for those of you wondering how much time is involved, if you're out there and your name is like Shem Phillips or something, Shem Phillips is watching, and you're like, oh, maybe I don't know if I have time. It's really only like I think like an hour a week at the minimum.
Yeah, like,
right.
I mean,
So
so it works with you and your kind of like whoever your partner ends up being, right, on either
yeah,
side. So there's flexibility there. But hey, I mean, the industry is a very small place. It's all about word of mouth. It's all about who you know. And honestly, you have to actually go get to know people
yeah,
in order to, kind of get anywhere.
yeah, and
Yeah, it's
that's what a
funny.
lot. Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead,
Jay.
Sam.
Well, I was going to say that is the other big question that people ask. Uh, how do you get involved as a blah blah blah? This is part of that. You can just go sign up. You can literally just go sign up. It's free.
Yeah.
Sign up. Say, I really want to get into X. You'll find a person, or they'll find a person for you, or the algorithm will find a person for you that is also into X but has like more experience than you. You'll link up, and from there, you'll meet more and more people. And I think there's some really easy ways to enter into this, and this is one of them. Jay, go ahead.
I was just going to comment on Erica's talk about the industry being big or small or things like that. It's really based on your perspective, whether you're inside or outside the industry. I've had this conversation with a number of people that it is either an extremely large, small industry, or it's an extremely small, large industry, depending on your perspective. When you take a look at the relationships and who knows who, the social currency that you have with different people, you go to a convention and we might recognize 30, 40, 50, 60 people there. But then there are other people that were like, oh my gosh, I would love to meet them. Can somebody hook up an introduction? So it's a really strange dynamic in my mind that it's both very, very large and yet seemingly very intimate and small at the same time.
I always like to say it's like the same few thousand people. Because it kind of honestly is. And you really do get to a point where everybody kind of knows each other if you're in the industry.
Yep.
Just because that's the way this industry is right now.
Yep, very much so, very much so. So let's move on to design philosophy. So Jay, first of all, can you give the viewers an idea of some of the games that you've worked on in the past, and then let us know what is it about those games that have your fingerprint on it? It's like that's how you design, or that's your style, or something like that. That's
Sure.
what I mean.
So one of the first games that I designed in the tabletop industry was for WizKids back in the olden days, MLB Sports Clicks, which was cool because it was a licensed product. When 3rd edition D&D came out, I did a lot of Dungeons and Dragons modules for Goodman Games, and Joseph Goodman is like a really great person in the industry who helped me make introductions and get me involved. But then everything kind of positioned me to being in the right place at the right time for me to get involved with Fantasy Flight Games. They had the Games Workshop license, so I was able to work on Blood Bowl Team Manager, the card game. That's a really popular game that a lot of people know me for. I was able to kind of sit at Eric Lang's elbow when he was designing Chaos in the Old World and be able to contribute to that thematically, but then I designed the expansion for Chaos in the Old World. I also got to design expansions for Wiz War and for Cosmic Encounter, two of my favorite games growing up. And then Star Wars came along, and the game I'm best known for is the X-Wing miniatures game, and then the Star Wars role-play line. And it's the line with the crazy-looking funky dice.
Yes.
And that led in, a universal system called Genesis. Other than that, I do a lot of freelance work now, working with a lot of different companies. Modifius out of England. I helped work on the new edition of Siege of the Citadel. I did their 2D20 system that powers like John Carter and Star Trek, and a number of other different systems and licenses that they have.
Very, very cool. So you like crossed the realm from role-playing games into board games and then back again, which is really cool. Because not everybody does that, and not everybody can do that. So I think it's really
not well
really
on both sides.
Yeah,
it's really weird because they are different disciplines. Like people think writing is writing. Well, writing fiction is very different than writing technical instructions. And it really is a different mindset, not only personally, but how you interact with your dev team and how you bounce ideas around and how you play test is so dramatically different, in my experience, between tabletop gaming and the more narrative, abstract role-playing games. But one of the through lines between most of this is crazy custom dice, love them, and some sense of narrative and story, which is why I've worked on so many licensed products and why I try to include flavor text and narrative and player agency so that the outcomes are influenced by player decision. And it doesn't just feel, even though they're dice, it feels like you had opportunities to mitigate luck, to steer fate, and work with it in that way. So those are some of the things that I really, really enjoy working with.
Very, very cool. So your philosophy towards game design, can you boil it down into a couple sentences? What do you think?
Don't be afraid to try strange things and big changes. Don't be afraid to create a prototype as quickly as possible. I try to crank out an early MVP candidate or a minimum viable product as soon as I can, even if it's on sticky notes and index cards, just to see if I've got an idea that works. Like I'm actually literally got a game right now that I've been designing over the last couple of days that's still just on index cards, just to see if the idea is worth putting more time and energy into. Mm-hmm. So there's nothing to stop you from getting started now with your idea.
Right. And if you were to say how we could recognize a J Little game from somebody else's games, what do you think that is? What's your like indelible fingerprint?
Well, I think everyone would like to say that it's something you haven't seen before or a combination of things that you haven't seen put together before. I really don't know because I try to work on a lot of different games. I had never worked on a war game, so I decided to set out and work on a war game. It was published by the Dietz Foundation called 3 Years of War last year. I love the Unlock puzzle games, so when an opportunity came up to work on Unlock, I like jumped at that, even though that's not the sort of thing I usually work on. So I think there's a little bit of everything because I enjoy games so much that I want to be involved with as many different people and as many different ideas as I can.
Very, very cool. And we've talked a little bit about your past projects, and we saw something that's maybe a present project.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit more about what you're working on currently, if you can, and if there's anything coming out in the near future.
So I'm really lucky to be able to work on a project this summer with a friend of mine that hasn't been announced yet, but it's an opportunity that I've been looking forward to. Otherwise, I love roll and Yahtzee style games because I love dice and I love push your luck. And so I've been taking my love of Dungeons and Dragons and my love of yacht style dice rolls, and I'm working on a series called Roll and Write Adventures, which are solitaire play Dungeons and Dragons style modules where it's Yahtzee style and push your luck dice mechanics to be able to, counter traps and fight monsters and solve puzzles and things like that as you go through the dungeon. So that's in an interesting stage right now where, again, I pushed out a really quick prototype to see if it works. And I'm satisfied that it works enough that I should keep working on it. And then this game that's on index cards right now, I was super excited about. I had this weird fever dream and grabbed some paper and tried to scribble out as much as I could before I forgot it. But it's a solo game about going up a necromancer's tower, and every level that you go up, one of the party members has to die. And at the end, the remaining party members face off against all the party members that died during the adventure. So you have to be really careful with how you allocate resources and who you send off to do the most dangerous quests and journeys, because you might end up having to face them again at the end. And I'm really, really excited about how that's been coming along.
That's so interesting.
I was going to say that reminds me of a couple of martial art movies, but I can't think of anything else on that.
Very, very interesting. So, like I said at the top, the reason why we're having Jay on today is because he posted something on Facebook that was like super interesting to me. And that's what we're going to talk about for pretty much the rest of the show, I think. And if anybody out there in Maple Syrup Land, like Shem Phillips or Josh Jerkson, who are watching right now, has any questions for Jay, let us know. We'll gladly ask them. And this one is about balance. So, Jay, why don't you tell us what your thoughts are on disruption and why disruption is more important than balance itself?
As you had alluded to, balance and what that means in a game is one of the things that I think game designers are asked most often. And I teach game design to college freshmen and sophomores, and that's obviously a question that's on their mind, as well as they're just starting to become a little bit more sophisticated with their thinking and really trying to consider all these different elements that make up a game. And I started to get really sick and tired of answering that question because I didn't want to be rude and I didn't want to be short with it. And then I realized that my answer kept changing because it depends on the game, it depends on my mood, it depends on the target audience. And so it made me really reconsider how important is balance to a game, and is something that is perfectly mathematically balanced fun? Does it feel like you have enough agency over it, or is the game playing itself? Is it a calculation rather than a, something that you're really, really involved with and engaged with as an experience? So as you noted in my Facebook post, I had basically said, I want to reframe this and start thinking about it from the other side. Rather than, does this mechanic help balance the game, is think about how much disruption does this mechanic cause? So rather than worrying about trying to balance everything, instead see how many ripples your changes make and how big the waves are. Because I think some disruption, some imbalance is good for a game. It requires you to adapt, to rethink your strategy. Anything that breaks you out of your normal stereotypical sort of thinking or approach to a game. And so it's okay for things to be odd, weird, out of the ordinary, maybe a little mathematically wonky on one side or the other, if it causes disruption, as long as there are enough of these that the magnitude of those disruptions are acceptable to both you as a designer and the players. I think players expect and even enjoy a little bit of the unexpected with those moments of disruption.
Mm-hmm. Especially in those highly thematic games that you were particularly involved with. That's kind of what they want. Sarah Shipp was commenting saying that imbalance creates tension, right?
Yes.
that unknown, that thing, right? And then you already alluded to it yourself, Jay, when you said, I wanted people to have a way to mitigate that kind of stuff, even if there was that tension. How do we, as players, execute our authority over the game, within maybe parameters of our character or our dice pool or whatever, our stats, to mitigate it so it's a little less tense for us but it's still tense for everybody else because they don't have that skill or whatever. And I think that's a really cool way of looking at it. Good morning to Ian O'Toole, who is all the way over on the, in the other areas of the world where it's now morning for them, I think. Josh Dirksen asks this, and maybe we can talk about, first generation X-Wing in terms of this disruption model that you're talking about. Josh is a huge fan of X-Wing. I don't know if you remember Josh. Josh was a tester for a lot of the Wave 1, Wave 2 ships, and he's also the person that made the Heroes of the Artillery Cluster solo missions for
Thank you, Josh.
And then I still have it here because and this is we're literally going full circle and including two shows because FFG couldn't do anything with the Heroes of Artillery Cluster. It went to your first employee, WizKids, and became Star Trek Alliance, the Dominion War campaign. So that story goes like full circle. And so Josh, first of all, wants to know how involved you were with the first edition X-Wing and the birth of that core design. But I was wondering if you can now, looking back at that, frame it in terms of disruption. Like, because there's a lot of stuff in that game.
Oh, yes. Being able to critically hit something else and have things hang on the fate of a die roll. But if you positioned yourself properly, if you selected the right cards, characters, and ship build, if you did all of these things, then you are able to exert some influence over the dice. But there's still that excitement. The gotcha moment when you are either pulling on the slot machine or opening up that Magic the Gathering booster or just about to roll the dice where anything could happen. And then once they hit the table, there's that excitement of trying to see how they resolve in that situation. So the focus icon was a big part of that. And I really need to give credit to Adam Sadler, one of the Sadler twins, for putting that together. He was really involved in the development of X-Wing as well. But I had not been at Fantasy Flight Games for very long. I had been there for about 2.5, maybe 3 years when the relationship with Games Workshop was winding down. I had worked on the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 3rd Edition. I had worked on Blood Bowl Team Manager and the Chaos in the Old World expansion. And then we started to get rumors and talking around internally about we might be getting Star Wars. We might be getting Star Wars. Oh my gosh, wouldn't it be awesome if we got Star Wars? And obviously I was really excited. I wanted to be associated with that license. It's arguably the most popular and well-known license in the world, and a big part of my youth and growing up. But there were so many more seasoned designers there. Corey Koneska was there. Kevin Wilson was there. Eric Lang was a freelancer there. And I'm thinking, yeah, it's not going to be me. There's no way they're going to trust me with one of the first games coming right out of the gate. Maybe once we get to the second, third year, then I'll be doing it. But my boss at the time, Michael Hurley, called me one day and said, we got the license. And I'm like, that is awesome. I'm really, really excited. I can't wait to hear what, Kevin and these guys come up with. And he's like, oh no. You're going to be designing the role-playing game and the minis game. Like, what? Yes, wow. You're going to design 2 of the first 3 games coming out. And I was thunderstruck. I couldn't respond at first. I'm like, which one do I do first? How do I work on these? What do we do? And it was just this moment of sheer enjoyment that was also sheer terror, because I know how much people love Star Wars, how much I love Star Wars. I'm like, I can't mess this up. I have to deliver a game that feels like Star Wars, that they want to quote the movies while they're playing, that they want to be able to see a movie moment while they're positioning ships on the board for X-Wing, or when they're executing some sort of devious plan or heist, or having some fierce firefight in the role-playing game. They need to see themselves in the movies. So those were pretty tall orders. But going back to the design of X-Wing, what was interesting is part of it was based on hard numbers and data of how much could we actually put into a base game. What could we ask people to pay for a base game? And once we settled around the $40 point, then you start to work back from the budget and go, how many dice is that? How many pieces of punch board is that? How many ship models do I get to work with? Mm-hmm. So
the answer was 3.
Yeah, absolutely. And we had to reverse engineer to get to that point. And it's not just 3, but it's specifically 1 X-Wing and 2 TIE fighters, thinking that is the classic matchup. That if nothing else, we want to be able to show this because we think of TIE fighters being more nimble but more fragile, and X-Wings being the staple of the rebellion forces. So as we were playing through this and I was playtesting, it still didn't feel right. Trying to figure out, how do we make this feel like a good matchup? And then we settled we actually went back and watched the movies quite a bit. And I decided that for me, the first, level of balance or disruption, depending on which perspective you're coming at it from, is under the right conditions with the right dice roll, an X-Wing needs to be able to one-shot a TIE fighter. So that was my starting point. That was the baseline, that 1 X-Wing with a pretty good pilot is going to be a good match for 2 rookie or academy TIE fighter pilots. And we kind of went from there, knowing that we had to be able to scale up from that. You're going to get your, Millennium Falcons and larger ships, your Y-Wings, bombers, B-Wings, things like that. But then you also had to be able to go under these ships and have the A-Wing and other ships up and down. So where is that power level? How do we manage these point systems? 100 points made sense. So started playing around with, all right, 1 X-Wing is going to be worth about this much. That means that the rookie pilots should be worth about this much. So they're roughly equal in point cost. And it was really building that initial equation of 1 good X-Wing pilot equals 2 rookie TIE fighter pilots. And working with that equation, that got us the base game, as well as a number of additional cards and pilots that you can use to play with those same 3 figures in a bunch of different configurations. And then that kind of carried through when we did the rest of the Wave 1 going into Wave 2 ships.
Right. So all of that is, did you have like actual spreadsheets with mathematical equations running, or was a lot of it kind of in your head and nudging it here and there?
So it started out with a lot of nudges and a lot of just playing around and chucking dice on the table. I had some die cast figures and starships and a whole bunch of toys. So started to play with the toys and how large an area are we going to do before we settled on the 3 foot by 3 foot. We're like, are we playing in a rectangle? Are we playing in a larger area, a smaller area? How many ships should you expect to be able to field with 100 points? Like what's a high end and a low end for that? But then I'm a big believer in tracking data. So yes, spreadsheets were involved, but as much data as I track, at some point it still comes down to, for me, a gut feeling. So even if the math is saying one thing, if your gut is saying something else, your gut might not always be right, but learn to trust your gut. You're a game designer for a reason. You got to this position because you were able to see something, have some sort of insight, or work with things in a way that other people couldn't. Otherwise, somebody else would have gotten the job. Somebody else would have designed X-Wing. So both with X-Wing and with the Star Wars roleplay dice, people are like, why? People have tried to like crack the math on those dice between the colors and the symbols and the distribution. And the only thing that I will tell them is, on an average roll, an average person should fail more often than they succeed, but they're going to fail forward and end up with a good side effect that will help them or a party member on a next effort. So it's like it's set up. What I feel like the movies, they're constantly running into struggle. They're constantly running into challenges, but they're working together to overcome them, or they're finding hidden opportunities to be able to navigate around them.
Yeah, it's really interesting because role-playing games are obviously a little bit different in terms of, absolute wins and losses, because there really isn't a win and loss con in a role-playing game. But the idea of a mechanic that feels right for the situation at hand, for the game at hand. And I mean, you'll notice that in Imperial Assault, the math isn't the same as the role-playing system. You just can't. It can't be, because the feels are similar, but the ramifications of those of the dice rolling is very, very different. In a lot of the role-playing games, you can fudge your way out of that, or you can role-play your way out of situations. Whereas in Imperial Assault, your character's now dead. And that's not a fun game. It's a very different thing, right? So very, very interesting. Now, going back to your idea about disruption and how much something disrupts the system, how much disruption did you allow for in X-Wing? What do you think? What was the most disruptive thing you think that you put into X-Wing?
Shields.
Oh, very interesting.
It's so weird, because how do you treat shields? Are they extra hull? Are they just ablative and suffer some damage? Should you be able to recharge them? In the movies, we hear them like redistribute their shields to different parts of the ship. Do we want to do that? Is that going to be too much bookkeeping at the table? How much disruption am I going to allow at the tabletop? I want this to be a quick playing game. I want this to be a game that can wrap up in a reasonable amount of time. And every additional level of micromanagement, even if it is closer to a simulation, even if it gets us, a higher level of fidelity, if it takes away from the experience, then that's too much disruption. And I found that having shields constantly recharge and being able to redistribute them was too much disruption on the pacing of the game. It took people out of the mindset. It took them out of their tactics. The opponent was bored and starting to stare off into space.
I'm going to do this little micro game over here. Yeah.
Well, because all you're really doing is more choices sound like fun, but really it just adds more time. Technically, so it really comes down to smart choices.
Yeah. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, because I haven't played Armada in a long time. Does Armada handle shields differently?
So what's interesting is Armada being the next scale up, that was a Corey Konieczka special. So I was not involved with the development of Armada, and I actually steered clear of that and was already working on another project when Armada was underway. So I can't remember all the different stages and steps that it went through, other than we knew early on that the dice system and combat would need to resolve differently, because instead of small dogfights, we're talking about capital ships, and we're talking about things that are moving and acting on a grander scale. So things need to feel cranked up a little bit. They need to feel different than it does in the kind of close quarters and frenetic pacing of X-Wing.
Right. Yeah. Josh Dirksen is saying that the injured pilot critical hit he found as being the most disruptive of them all.
So I love the critical hit system. That was another thing that I think is kind of a special of mine, is I want these different effects to happen. The critical hit chart in the role-playing games is a great example of that. There's a wide range of things that can happen, and they build up over time. But I wanted critical hits to feel very unpredictable in X-Wing. So you've got to think carefully, knowing that, all right, it is unlikely that this event will occur, but I need to be prepared for the fact that if it mathematically can occur, it's going to happen, right? And so that's a big thing that I teach my
somebody in
students.
some ship at this table, it's going to happen.
So if you look at a bell curve of the distribution of results, you start to get to like the 0.01% chance on the far ends of that curve. And I'm like, when you think about the number of people playing this game and the number of dice rolls, so I have a humorous anecdote about that. When I was designing Warhammer Fantasy, we were designing high-level play. And I wanted to create a fire wizard spell that if you rolled 4 critical failures on, you immolated yourself. You blew yourself up. So I put that on a card and thought, isn't that funny, right? It's just
never going to happen. It'll be hilarious if it does.
Right. Just seeing it written down there that you can blow yourself up has the effect that I wanted. It has a value to it, and just being able to scare somebody that this could happen. That product wasn't out for like a month before I saw somebody post online that, our fire wizard was all cocky. We were being attacked by goblins. He said that he'd take care of it. And the next thing we knew, we had this like smoldering pile of ash next to us. Like, oh my goodness, I am never going to make that mistake again. Great story, awesome session report, but people are going to remember those extremes. So even though they're unlikely to occur, as a designer, you have to keep in mind that at some point they will, and people tend to share stories about the extremes.
Yes.
You don't talk about the session where everything went exactly the way you expected it to. You talk about the crazy things, the things where something extremely good or extremely bad happened, in my experience.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, the crazy chain of events that it's purely circumstantial or coincidental or whatever you found, like it's not going to happen all the time, but when it does, it's like those are the moments.
Yep, they're memorable. You'll be able to talk about those years from now.
Right. Ian O'Toole, who is an artist, brings up his field in relation to what you're talking about. That it's a similar process with illustration. There are almost formulas for like color palettes, complementaries, et cetera, but it's when you push outside those that you find the really interesting stuff, right? So I'm looking at a bunch of Ian's covers here right now and just seeing like, there's definitely some times when he's pushed way into a palette in one direction, and it just like, oh, that's why it's so like vibrant and interesting. And it's finding out, how far can we go before we've like made somebody's brain reject what we're giving them. And then the idea of those comfortable balance points, like you're talking about, Jay, when you say nobody talks about all the 7s that they've rolled on 2 days.
Right.
But they'll constantly talk about the 12s and the 2s, right? Because those are those outliers. And it's really, really interesting from a balance perspective, and we talk about disruption. We're talking about disruption. We're going to get more 2s and more 12s. But what do they do, and how do they affect the rest of the system? And that actually I found really fascinating when you're talking about disruption, not just in the mathematical percentages and things like that, but in the time it takes to then deal with that also disrupts play. The brain space the rules take disrupts the flow of the game. All that kind of stuff is these things that I think people who are new to design don't really take into consideration when they talk about balance. They are literally worried about mathematical balance, and that's it. But balance to me is deeper, at least like 2 or 3 layers deeper than just the math. And the math, in fact, is the least interesting and the least important of all those balances, all those things to balance.
Well, let's be honest, though. If it's just the math, you're getting a very different experience, right?
Yes.
So if you're somebody who is okay with the type of game where I mean, you're not even done yet, but you can already tell you accidentally messed up because at one point it's already going to make it, like, that's the type of game where the math is already perfectly balanced, but you know you've lost before you've even gotten there. Because you did not make the optimal move that was supposed to happen. And funny enough, people think that's what games are supposed to be about. But if you did that in an RPG, that's a bad GM, because that person basically says there's only one path through this. It's the one that I've decided is the most clever, and you're not doing anything but that. And so when you have numbers that are perfectly balanced, you're basically doing the exact same thing. You're saying, well, I don't care what you want to do because this is exactly what's going to happen.
So in a game like chess, that's fine, right? Like that's built into the DNA of that game, but that's not how I want my games to be remembered or how I want them to feel. But going back to Disruption really quickly, I think there's a great video game analogy for this.
Cool.
When you are playing a video game, how many buttons do you have to click to save your game? So do you have to hit escape and then go to the save profile menu and then go to the save file menu, and then it pulls up a screen for you to enter in a file name for that, and then hit enter, and then hit confirm yes, and then hit back to get into the game. So like, I've played games where there are literally 10 to 12 steps to just save your game. Talk about disruption. That completely takes you out of the game. Rather, if you've got a 1 or 2 button quick save opportunity or something like that, so you can stay in the game, that's what are you asking your players to do? Like literally asking them to do: pick up dice, roll dice, move figures. Each task
all the math in their head.
Yeah, and each task that isn't fun or cool counts against the overall. If you want to talk about balance, you got to be able to balance the fun and cool decisions with the just the chores that need to get done. Sometimes math needs to get added. Sometimes stuff needs to get moved around or dealt or shuffled. Those aren't necessarily the things that we remember or the fun points. So for each one of those, you have to remember to offset that with things that they find cool, exciting, and engaging.
I would say offset it with at least 3. For each one procedural thing you're asking somebody to do at least 3 fun things. I will say, however, I will say, however, that I do to save a game, I'd have to go find a ribbon. I'd have to go find a typewriter ribbon, and then I'd have to wait until I got to the room where I can actually save that game, and then I'd probably die while I was trying to save my game, because that's always what happens to me in Resident Evil. So, although I think I haven't played a more recent Resident Evil, but I think in the more recent ones they've actually got rid of that whole system. But I thought that was the funniest thing when I was a kid. It's like, oh, you gotta actually go get like a typewriter ribbon? That's so weird, but also kind of the theme of the game, I guess, that it's a weird game. But
it makes sense for that, but it wouldn't have made sense for a computer role-playing game at the time.
No,
it wouldn't have made sense for Sonic the Hedgehog or something like that, right? Like a platformer. But for Resident Evil, maybe those steps, maybe those mechanics, maybe those procedural things that they have you do add to the environment. I mean, technical limitations aside.
Yeah, I think it did because it made you more tense.
Yeah. Procedure doesn't have to be bad, right? Procedure is telling you the steps you're going to do something. And I mean, funny enough, it can sound super negative though, because of the way we tend to use it. But procedure should just be the course of action that you can be taking, not necessarily the only thing you could be doing.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really good point that games require a process or procedure of some point. I mean, that's why rule books exist, to be able to walk you through what the procedures are for this game.
These things in this order, yeah.
But they need to make sense. They need to feel, if it's a really thematic game, it needs to feel organic, like these things flow together and feel like they are in the right order. Are you drawing cards at the beginning of your turn or at the end of your turn? And that can have a huge impact on the game, depending on how many cards you're drawing, right? So process matters.
Yep. No, it does, because it's your logic of your game. People forget that sometimes. Your game has logic.
So before I forget, I just want to say a quick little playtesting tip here. Think about your game in the number of steps that it has. So if you draw first, then roll for resources, then purchase, then trade, if you've got certain steps that are always taking place in a certain order, take those steps, write them down on index cards, and shuffle them up, and just try your game with the exact same mechanics that just resolve in a different order of operations.
Oh, that's neat.
And see how that works. And it might suck. You might find something interesting out about it, shuffle them again, and try it another time. For example, in a game, if you're going to be drawing 2 or 3 cards on your turn, I usually try to put that toward the end of the turn so that people don't have to stop and wait for me while I read this card, compare it to all the other cards, compare it to everything on the board, and then make my decision. If I'm doing that at the end of my turn, Erica can start their turn while I'm going through and evaluating the new cards that I have.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
You're slowing down the AP because they have until their next turn now to consider it.
Exactly.
They can be all AP they want on
their own
right?
time. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And it's funny because there's Daryl Andrews. He had this thing against people who would say, downtime's the worst. He's going, no, I need downtime. I want downtime so that I can actually not demonstrate, AP while it's my own turn. I want to think about it because I want to win the game. I want to have a strategic play. So, if you're doing your turn and I have my cards in my hand, like Jay said, then I can do that during that downtime. And there's other reasons why Daryl likes downtime. Sometimes it's to play a completely other game at another table. Sometimes it's to take a nap.
It's a nap at the table, and he'll still win, even though he only wakes up between turns.
Yes.
It's a magic challenge that not everybody has.
Yeah. But no, I think you're right in terms of, procedure gives us the framework, like the skeleton of the game. Procedure tells us what to expect.
But it's not the fun.
And then it isn't not the fun stuff, but then also gives us that space that I think people need within the game to make those critical decisions, to have those cool experiences afterwards on their own turn. While we're on this note, just because it's something I was talking about the other day, here's my kind of, it's not my new way of doing thing, but it's a way that I'm like actually more consciously thinking about is all the procedure. I want a limit as much as possible, but there needs to be some, like you said. But I don't want my rules to be much more than they have to be ever. And so I want to cut down all of that stuff into really easy to follow procedural things.
Bite-sized pieces.
Yeah. And then all of the interesting stuff, I actually want to put all that stuff on the cards themselves.
Yeah,
like
you can
anything that breaks those rules,
a ton of information on those cards, on other materials.
Just the one-off, instead of these weird technicalities.
In the rules, I don't want that.
You don't want them in the rules because now it's confusing.
So I do a lot of exception-based design. Here are the main rules, and these rules are true until a game effect tells you otherwise. Magic the Gathering is filled with this, right? If you really look at it and scrape everything else off of its framework, there are only a couple steps and stages to Magic the Gathering, a few fundamental rules that you have to follow. But then every individual card is some sort of exception. It's you are able to cast this unless you don't sacrifice a land, or this thing comes out and can trample, which is a special exception to how it damages stuff. Like, they put all of that off on the cards. There is a 1,000-page rulebook if you want to get to it, but the starter sets are pretty small and pretty approachable for a reason. They strip all that other stuff out. They give you just the bare bones of here's how the turn order works. Here's what you do in this order. Everything else is going to be on these cool cards, and they're going to feel like cool things because you get to do something different. You get to do something special. You get to break a rule.
Yes,
and that's fun.
Exactly. Yeah, it totally is. Josh actually is commenting or asking a question around what you suggested with shuffling the cards around. He asks, is there a game you worked on where shuffling the procedure steps produced a more interesting design? If so, what was it before?
So Blood Bowl Team Manager, absolutely. This was one of the games where I first started doing this. There were a number of steps that take place on an individual player turn, but because we're playing in a round structure, there are some pre-round and post-round bookkeeping and things that take place as well. And the difference of when you're drawing cards into your hand versus when you're able to play, when somebody else is able to respond. So because I liked the tabletop so much and I wanted to recreate that feeling, but I couldn't just recreate the game, otherwise play the tabletop. I had the things that I wanted to be able to happen in the game, and then I had to decide, do they go on cards or are they meta rules that can be applied outside of these special exceptions? And I really did have a lot of things on index cards that I had spread out on my desk. And then when I'd play through it, if something didn't feel right, I'd just move these 2 cards around and see if it felt different. Or it's not really a deck building game. Could you draw all of your cards at the end instead of at the beginning to form your hand? Well, okay, is there resource management? Could we do it in this order instead? And I played around a lot when I was doing Blood Bowl Team Manager in particular. The game 3 Years of War that I put together also does that, because it's essentially a resource management game where only bad things happen. So you're trying to figure out how to spend your resources in the way that hurts you the least amount, knowing that something bad is going to happen. And because I had a very, very specific feeling I wanted to evoke, it just wasn't right. It just wasn't right. I changed the order of operations a little bit. And when you make certain evaluations, when you compare the resources that I have to the requirement for the season, and those little changes, by just changing steps 5 and 6 around, for example, made really big changes to the way that games feel.
That's really, really neat. I think that's fascinating that a game can change just by changing a few of the orders of operation. And sometimes it's not necessarily even a mechanical effect. Sometimes it's just it makes more sense. Like it just logically
like
feels that way.
Story flow, right? Like if you really think of it like that way, what you're doing is you have a story structure. Depending on where something pops up in a story, tells you kind of what type of story it is. So when you play around with something like that in a game, it's very similar that you're going to change the tone, the pacing, all of that based on where those things pop up. And so obviously you're playing with the expectations, meaning like, I think maybe Seth and I have had this conversation before. I started to get really mad at shows that use types of shots that are very specifically from another genre, but not doing it, like looking through the bushes at something, but then nothing happens. They're like, what's the point of that shot? That is a well-established horror shot. What are you doing with it? Nothing. But what was the point of that? You know, it's kind of similar in any other form of entertainment. We really got to think of games as the same way. Is there are certain genre staples, and you can do them in any particular order. But if you're going to throw extras in, it needs to make sense, and it needs to make sense in those orders.
I think one of the things that, if you're not sure if you believe this or not, and think order of operations may or may not actually change the way your game feels, change when scoring takes place. That's a huge one. If you have scoring take place at the beginning of your turn, before you've done anything, before you've enacted your master plan, and it has to survive an entire round of other people messing with what you've done to be able to score what you were going to do, versus scoring at the end of your turn when you have more control over it, when you're physically directing all of the things to end up with the either resource engine or scoring methodology that you wanted. Like that can completely change the feel of the game, how you're invested in the game, how you think about it strategically, and ultimately, because so many games are tied to victory points as the victory condition, how you feel about what you did. So that's a big change.
Totally. Yeah, that's ginormous. So I think that's a really, really interesting design sort of assignment almost to give to somebody. It's like, hey, you got a game, you don't know what's wrong. Here's one way to think about it. It's almost like, have you seen Jesse Schell's Book of Lenses?
Yes.
Yeah, it'd almost be like one of his lenses, or like Brian Eno's Oblique Strategies for Music Writing, where it's just like these random things that you can try with your song, and or not even your song, it's just things to do. Like some of the oblique strategies are go take a walk, like literally just go take a walk, and when you come back, now try to write, because you're doing something different with your brain. You're thinking about it differently.
I make my kids do stuff like that all the time, just because they're still learning that a difference. That it's like you will adjust each time you reassess or kind of like go back to something. Whereas like that's something people have to learn. That
I can't remember to properly credit the person, but there's this approach called Scamper, where it's an acronym.
Scamper.
Yeah,
okay.
It's like if you want to change things around, I can't remember what the first S is, but combine something, add something, manipulate something, prioritize something, evaluate something, rearrange something. And it's this like list of things that you can do. And
substitute is the S, the other S?
Yeah, it's substitute, combine, adapt, modify, put to another use, eliminate, and reverse. That's awesome.
So what's interesting is they come in flashcards too. So there are different exercises that you can do or different questions that it will ask you. And so you might be dealt to reverse something and to adjust the magnitude of something. All right, where am I going to put those in my game? How am I going to affect that? So I ended up buying that Think Pack of Thinker toys and that little brainstorming kit, and that's been an incredibly useful tool. Thank you for looking for that. Could you name drop the author of that?
Yeah, I'm going to try and find it. One sec. I'm looking at all the images, so I'll find the author in a second. Keep going. So you were Thinker toys. What were those?
So it's part of this Scamper approach, and the person who designed it has a series of tools that you can purchase. So he's got some books that are these fantastic resources on how to train your brain to brainstorm better. And this deck of cards that have these Scamper prompts on them are one of the tools that he has, and I use those with my students. I can't remember the person's name, unfortunately. So things like that,
find them, don't worry.
Really, really valuable.
I'll post about it in the shop talk.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Alex Fickney Osborne in 1953. That's when it was first proposed and was further developed by Bob Eberle in 1971. Yeah, Bob Eberle in his book Scamper: Games for Imagination Development.
Yep. So that's one
awesome.
of the books on my shelf. Yeah.
Very nice.
I will have to look that up. That sounds really good. It sounds like something that your students could benefit from as well, Erica. Just little scamperers all around scampering.
It's because I honestly, anything that gives kind of just a structure to approach, like people know all of these things individually, but if you don't think about it as like a method, it makes it a little bit different.
Like,
and it's literally just like a list.
People know what combining things means, but unless somebody gives you a prompt and says, all right, in your game, combine two things that aren't already combined.
Yeah.
Oh,
now what's going to happen, right? Well, that's exactly it. That's all the types of stuff that, we talk about as educators. Like all three of us are educators, and that's all I ask my students to do is like, have you ever thought about it this way? And have you ever thought about it this way? And if I could just hand them this list of 7 words, maybe I'd be out of a job. No, I'm kidding. I wouldn't be. But this is a good list for designers specifically. It's like, if you're stuck, what about changing something? Substitute it. What about combining something? What about, I think those are great ways, great prompts to think about as you're going through and you're trying to figure out what's not quite hitting right in my game right now, because that's usually the thing. Yeah.
Here's an example of using it. Is I had a separate movement phase from an action point phase where you could spend action points to perform different things. I'm like, why do we have this entire separate phase? Why don't I just combine these and make movement part of, just give them a few more action points on their turn and make movement one of the choices on the menu. And so we eliminate an entire phase and they get to choose when to move, whether it's at the beginning of their turn, end of their turn, etc.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of interesting things that you can do with minimal prompting.
Right. And I think it's a good tool for a lot of, novices to have just print it out, stick it on your computer, put it in front of you. Just when you're thinking about, when you're stuck, just use these to go through as a prompt. Is there anything I could do? It's literally 7 words. And I think there's 7 words that might change a lot of people's lives, and at least their perspective on game design. And so, it's funny because I co-design a ton and Erica does as well. And so we often will do this with each other, all of these things. But for a solo designer who doesn't have somebody to bounce ideas off of, something like this could be like a godsend.
Yeah.
It is really tough to design in a vacuum. And so having tools and resources like this, it's never going to proxy another person who can dynamically, riff with, but it can provide really valuable feedback that otherwise you can't really sum up by yourself. You need something else to reflect, to contribute, to add ideas, because you always know what you mean. That's why you're the worst editor of your own rulebook. You know what you mean, so you will infer
all the time.
Yeah, right. But sometimes you need that outside voice, and sometimes something physical, like a deck of cards, like a book, can help be that outside voice.
Right, for sure. So not only do you need to disrupt your balance within a game somewhat, or check to see how much it's being disrupted, you might need to disrupt your mental flow of how you're making that game, or the flow of the game itself, in order to get the best out of it, I think. So there's a lot going on here, Jay. It's been so fun talking to you.
I was just saying, really quickly, I'll just add too, it's
Yeah.
like a question why you need that perfect balance. Like what is driving you to think that the numbers have to equal some way to be
because balanced? The word balance. It's because the word balance means that, unfortunately. That's not what we talk about.
What I think it's just stopping to ask yourself why sometimes might be important.
There's no official checklist of things that you need to include in a game, right? So you have to tick off balance. That's not a thing. So
no, I mean, play testing for sure is something I would love for you to tick off. But balance really isn't. Balance is an overall holistic state of a game more than it is any one component or something. Yeah, right. Does it feel fair? Does it feel good on all sides? That's what I think balance is. If you lose the game, did you feel like you were smashed and slaughtered and had no choice and no chance? Or do you feel like, hey, given another situation, or I could have done better? I think that's moving towards a good state of balance.
Did I have interesting choices? Were there meaningful decisions? And if I played it again, could I play better? Those are three of the things that I really try to drill into my students.
Excellent. So for those of you out there who are interested in taking a course, Jay teaches at
UW Stout in Menominee, Wisconsin. I also teach summer camps and a winter class. That's through the university, but I also do workshops at places like Protospiels.
There you go. Excellent. And you can find Jay at j_little@paintedthumb.com. And you can find out more about Jay at www.paintedthumb.com. There you go. And if you're looking for Erica on Twitter, she is at Erica Buyuris. Yeah, we will just Jesse is Jesse. There's Jesse.
Poke him for you if anything you want to say.
Yeah. And you can come talk to me at Senfeng Lim on Twitter. I am officially over 4,444 followers. That was a very scary time of my life, because if you don't know, four is like the worst number in Chinese numerology, and there were 4 of them, and it was super scary for me. That was scary.
Well, just wait until you get to a whole bunch of 8s, and you'll be all happy.
Yeah, then I'll be super happy. Actually, if I ever get to 8,888, I'm just stopping Twitter right there.
Yeah, you're like,
no more
I quit Twitter.
Freeze it now.
Yes, I'm going to freeze my account. If you want to talk to us about maple syrup, we're at maple syrup on Twitter. And if you like what you see today and want to see more of it, consider backing us at patreon.com/maple syrup. Let's see what else there is. So I will be giving a talk this weekend, actually, on board game development and aligning vision between designers, publishers, and us in the middle. Developers are always in the middle of that. That'll be on the 15th at 2:30 Eastern. So go to www.boardgamedesignconference.com and you can sign up there. The keynote speaker is Dr. Rainer Nitzia, who will be talking next weekend. And then the other thing that's happening on our own site on the Maple Syrup Shop Talk page on Facebook is Pakachka Con 2021. May 21st is the deadline, so not this Friday, but the next Friday. It's literally 6 minutes and 40 seconds of slides and talking. That's it. So if you have anything you want to talk about in terms of game design or otherwise, that's what Pakachka Con is about. I'll be doing one on psychology and gaming in terms of developmental psychology and how I use it to make games. And people are doing stuff like resonance in gaming. People are doing stuff about representation in gaming. So just anything you're super passionate about talking about, and if you think you can talk about it for 6 minutes and 40 seconds, please sign up. There's a list, and record a bunch of slides and a video, and then your audio goes on top of it, and that's it. And we'll hopefully have a couple hours worth of content for everybody to watch and learn from. So Jay, you should come in and give a little talk about that, about disruption.
Sounds very interesting.
Yeah, actually,
Indeed.
disruption.
Yeah.
For 6 minutes, you want like one focus. So that one focus would probably be perfect.
So this meandering 1 hour wouldn't fit down into a nice little package.
6 minutes.
Well, I think you could. I think you could take everything we talked about today and distill it down to 6 minutes and 40 seconds. And on that note, Jay, what is your final piece of advice for everybody out there in Maple Syrup Land who maybe wants to make a game?
One of the best pieces of advice I ever got was from Eric Lang, and that is, you will never make anybody mad by giving them too much credit. So make sure that you thank the people that have helped you along the way. Make sure that if you are in an opportunity where you can help somebody else, that you share that enthusiasm and that insight that you have. But be grateful for the opportunities that you have, and be thankful to the people who help provide them.
Excellent. And that is a great note to just bring us back to the Tabletop Mentorship Program.
Yes.
If you have any inclination towards doing some of that kind of stuff as a mentor or as a mentee, go sign up now. The deadline is the 17th of May. And the last thing that I wanted to talk about today before we go is Friday Night Forums. We had our first one last week. I unfortunately had my vaccine the day before, so I kind of slept through when I was supposed to start, and then we started like 40 minutes late. It's fine, we got it done. But we had a good time with Joanna Lee and Mendez on the show, talking about martial arts and representation of culture in gaming. And we're going to continue the talk this week with more people talking about Asian culture in gaming to celebrate Asian American and Pacific Islanders Heritage Month. So come see us at 8 o'clock on the Maple Syrup Show. Well, the Maple Syrup channel, I don't know, whatever, on the page. We'll be there on Friday night, 8 o'clock Eastern time. All right. And on that note, we'll see everybody later. It was great to have you, Jay. You're wonderful.
Thank you very much.
So insightful. Erica, good to see you. Thanks everybody for watching. Josh, Shem, Ian, everybody out there in Maple Syrup Land. We'll see everybody later. Bye.
Bye.